Hey everyone, welcome back for another deep dive. Today we're going to be focusing on some fascinating insights from Justin Trudeau, Canada's Prime Minister, about his relationship with former U.S. President Donald Trump. So Trudeau recently sat down for an interview on MSNBC while he was in Washington, D.C. for former President Carter's funeral.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so a pretty somber occasion, but as you can imagine, the conversation quickly shifted to the always complex dynamic between the U.S. and Canada, and let's just say Trump's idea of Canada as the 51st state is where things get really interesting.
Yeah, the timing of this interview is key for understanding what Trudeau was saying.
Yeah.
It actually took place in 2025 after Trump's second term as president.
Okay.
So this isn't just hypothetical. They've actually worked together.
Mm.
That real-world experience really shines through in Trudeau's comments.
So let's unpack this whole 51st state thing. Trump repeatedly suggested that Canada should just become part of the U.S. I mean, did he really think that was going to fly?
Well, Trudeau himself seemed to think it was more of a tactic than a genuine proposal. He called it a non-starter, suggesting it was a way for Trump to keep people off balance and distracted from, actual issues.
Hold on, I'm not sure I follow that. How does suggesting something like annexation keep people off balance? What's the strategy there?
It's a bit like a magician using misdirection.
Yeah.
By throwing out this completely unrealistic idea, Trump shifts the focus away from potentially tougher topics he doesn't want to discuss, like trade deals or tariffs.
Ah, okay. So by talking about something outrageous, he steers the conversation away from things that could be more problematic for him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's a way of controlling the narrative and keeping the other side on the defensive.
Clever, but also kind of frustrating if you're trying to have a serious conversation about, say, the impact of tariffs on both economies.
Precisely. And that's exactly the point Trudeau makes. He argues that these outlandish statements distract from real-world issues that actually affect people's lives.
So how did Trudeau respond to this whole annexation idea? Did he just laugh it off?
Well, he initially dismissed it as a non-starter, but then he countered with a pretty playful suggestion of his own. He said maybe Canada would consider joining the U.S., but only in exchange for Vermont and California, or certain parts of the country.
Oh, I bet that got a reaction.
It seems like it did make Trump uncomfortable. The conversation quickly moved on to other topics. It makes you wonder if humor is always the best tool when you're dealing with international diplomacy.
Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah.
So what did they end up talking about instead?
Well, they did touch on the issue of tariffs. And here's where you really start to see Trudeau's concern about the real-world consequences of Trump's policies.
It's interesting to think back to those 2018 tariffs on steel and aluminum.
Yes. Remember how Canada retaliated with tariffs on American goods? In the end, it hurt businesses on both sides of the border.
Right, and this is where Trudeau's point gets really interesting. Trump campaigned on this whole America First platform with all these promises of putting American workers first. But Trudeau is arguing that these tariffs actually hurt American workers. By driving up prices and potentially even leading to job losses, it really highlights the complex economic and political realities behind these decisions.
It also raises some important questions for us as listeners. If these policies harm American workers, as Trudeau suggests, why would Trump propose them in the first place? It seems like understanding the political motivations behind economic policies is crucial here.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder about the long-term impact on the relationship between the two countries, right?
Definitely. It seems like there's a real tension there.
So Trudeau brings up Trump's annexation idea. Then they have this somewhat awkward exchange about tariffs. What else did they cover?
Well, this is where the conversation takes a bit of a personal turn. Trudeau actually opens up about his decision to resign from office. It's really interesting because he links this personal decision to a much broader trend happening around the world, what political scientists call anti-incumbent sentiment.
Anti-incumbent sentiment. Explain that to me like I'm 5.
Okay, imagine you're playing a game and someone keeps winning over and over again. Eventually, even if they're playing fair, the other players might get tired of it and want someone new to have a chance. That's kind of what's happening in politics right now. People are getting tired of seeing the same faces in charge. Even if those leaders are doing a decent job, they just want change.
That makes sense. So Trudeau is stepping down because he feels like people are just ready for something new, even if his party has been doing well.
Exactly. And this interview took place shortly before he stepped down. So it really offers a glimpse into his mindset at the time. It's fascinating to hear him reflect on his decision in this context.
It does make you wonder if this anti-incumbent feeling is happening everywhere, or if it's more specific to certain countries or political systems.
That's a great question, and one we could definitely explore further. But let's stick with Trudeau for now. He seems to think this desire for change is pretty widespread. He actually says that Even though his party was doing well on things like handling the pandemic and the economy, there's still this sense of frustration with incumbents.
So what's causing this frustration, do you think?
Well, Trudeau suggests that part of it might be due to the influence of social media. Everyone is constantly bombarded with information, and it's easy to get caught up in negativity and outrage. That can lead to a feeling of dissatisfaction with the status quo, even if things aren't objectively that bad.
I can see that. It's like everyone is always looking for something to complain about. And social media definitely amplifies that.
Exactly.
Hmm.
And it's not just about complaining either. It's about feeling like your voice isn't being heard, that the system isn't working for you. So when someone new comes along and promises change, it can be very appealing, even if they don't have specific plans.
I guess that makes sense. So what does all of this mean for progressives like Trudeau? Is there anything they can learn from his experience?
That's a really interesting question, and one that Trudeau seems to be wrestling with himself. He actually argues that progressives need to be careful about how they frame their policies if they want to connect with voters who are feeling this sense of frustration and disillusionment.
What do you mean by frame their policies?
Well, he specifically cautions against leaning too heavily on what he calls woke messaging.
Woke messaging. I feel like I've heard that term thrown around a lot, but I'm not sure I fully understand what it means.
You're not alone. It's become a bit of a buzzword. And like a lot of buzzwords, its meaning can be a little slippery. But in general, woke is often used to describe a focus on social justice issues, particularly those related to race, gender, and inequality.
Okay, so if someone is considered woke, they're generally seen as being very aware of these social justice issues.
Exactly. And they're often very vocal about advocating for change and calling out injustice. Now, that in itself isn't necessarily a bad thing. But Trudeau's point is that framing every issue through this lens can be counterproductive.
Why is that?
Well, he's basically saying that while the ideas behind these woke policies might be good, the word itself has become so controversial that it actually prevents progress.
Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine you're trying to sell a delicious cake that everyone hates the name of. No one's going to buy it, right? They might love the ingredients. They might even be craving cake. But the name is a total turnoff. It's the same with political policies. If you're constantly using language that alienates a large portion of the population, you're not going to be very effective at getting your ideas across.
So Trudeau is basically saying that progressives need to find a way to talk about these important issues without turning people off.
Exactly. He thinks they need to find a more grounded, practical approach, one that focuses on issues that directly impact people's lives. Things like the cost of living, affordable health care, and job security.
Those are definitely things that resonate with a lot of people, regardless of their political affiliation.
Right. It's about connecting with voters on a gut level, addressing their concerns and offering tangible solutions, rather than getting lost in abstract debates that might not resonate with the average person.
So he's advocating for a more pragmatic approach, focusing on tangible results rather than ideological purity.
Exactly. He seems to have learned some hard-won lessons during his time in office, especially dealing with someone like Trump. And he's suggesting that other progressives could benefit from his experience.
This is all incredibly insightful. It makes you wonder what else Trudeau has learned. During his time as Prime Minister, especially when it comes to dealing with someone as unpredictable as Trump, what else did they discuss in this interview?
Well, this is where the conversation shifts back to a more global perspective. Remember how we were talking about that anti-incumbent sentiment earlier? Well, Trudeau seems to think that this feeling is connected to how progressives frame their policies, especially in relation to economic issues.
Oh, this is interesting. So he's not just talking about Canada here. He's thinking about the bigger picture, how this is playing out all over the world.
Exactly. He even goes so far as to say that if progressives don't adapt their messaging, they risk losing ground to the political right, who are often much more adept at tapping into people's fears and anxieties.
Whoa, that's a pretty stark warning.
It is. And it's one that I think we should take seriously.
I agree. I'm really curious to hear more about what he has to say on this.
He's basically saying that progressives need to get better at connecting with people on a visceral level, speaking to their everyday struggles and offering solutions that feel real and achievable. If they don't, they risk coming across as out of touch and elitist, which plays right into the hands of populist movements on the right.
So it's not enough to just have good ideas. You have to be able to communicate those ideas in a way that resonates with people, especially those who might be feeling left behind or ignored by the current system.
Exactly. He's saying that progressives need to find a way to bridge the gap between their ideals and the lived realities of everyday people. And that might mean being willing to compromise on some of their more ambitious goals in order to achieve concrete progress on issues that matter to voters.
It sounds like he's learned a lot from having to work with someone like Trump, who is a master at appealing to people's emotions, even if his policies didn't always deliver on his promises.
Absolutely. And it's a lesson that progressives around the world would be wise to heed. Because, let's face it, the political landscape is changing, and the old ways of doing things might not be effective anymore.
I'm really starting to see how all of this ties together. You have this global trend of anti-incumbent sentiment, fueled by social media and economic anxiety. And then you have this warning from Trudeau about the need for progressives to adapt their messaging if they want to stay relevant. It's a lot to process, but it's incredibly important to understand.
It is. And it makes you realize that politics isn't just about abstract ideas or ideological debates. It's about real people's lives. And the choices that leaders make have a direct impact on those lives.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about the big picture stuff, tariffs, annexation, global political trends. But what about some of the more specific issues facing the U.S. and Canada? Did they discuss anything like that in the interview?
They did. In fact, Trump apparently brought up his concerns about the U.S.-Canada border, specifically regarding migration and fentanyl trafficking.
Well, that's interesting. I remember that being a big talking point during Trump's presidency. What did Trudeau have to say about it?
Well, he was pretty firm in pushing back against some of Trump's claims. He emphasized that Canada is not the source of these problems, pointing out that less than 1% of illegal migrants and fentanyl entering the U.S. actually come from Canada.
So he was basically saying, hey, don't blame us for your problems.
Pretty much. But he also highlighted Canada's willingness to cooperate on these issues, mentioning billions of dollars in investments to further strengthen border security.
That's a smart move. He's standing up for Canada's interests, while also showing that he's willing to work with the U.S. to address shared challenges.
Exactly. It's a delicate balancing act, and one that Trudeau seems to have navigated quite well. He's firm but diplomatic, assertive but not aggressive.
I guess that's the kind of approach you need when you're dealing with someone like Trump, who is known for his, shall we say, unconventional negotiating style.
Absolutely. And it speaks to the complexities of managing a shared border. It's not just about security. It's also about trade tourism and the flow of people and goods that are vital to both economies.
Right. The U.S. and Canada are deeply intertwined. And any decisions made about the border need to take those interdependencies into account.
Precisely. It's not a simple issue, and there are no easy solutions, but it's one that both countries need to work together on if they want to maintain a strong and healthy relationship.
So stepping back for a moment, how would you characterize Trudeau's overall approach to dealing with Trump? Was he too accommodating? Too willing to compromise? Or did he strike the right balance between defending Canadian interests and maintaining a working relationship with a powerful neighbor?
That's a really tough question, and one that historians will probably debate for years to come. There's no easy answer. On the one hand, Trudeau faced immense pressure to maintain a stable relationship with the U.S., given its economic and political clout. On the other hand, he also had a responsibility to uphold Canadian sovereignty and push back against policies that were detrimental to Canadian interests.
It sounds like he was walking a tightrope. And it must have been made even more difficult by Trump's unpredictable nature. I mean, traditional diplomatic norms often seem to go out the window during his presidency.
Absolutely. It created a very volatile, uncertain environment, and leaders like Trudeau had to constantly adapt and recalibrate their strategies.
I can only imagine the stress. But speaking of stepping down, let's go back to Trudeau's decision to resign. He mentioned that growing frustration with incumbents globally was part of his reasoning. Could you elaborate on that a bit more?
Sure. This is a trend we've seen play out in many democracies around the world. Voters are increasingly disillusioned with the status quo, and they're yearning for change and new leadership. It's a complex phenomenon, and there are a lot of factors contributing to it.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, the rise of social media has definitely played a role. It's amplified political polarization and created these echo chambers where people are constantly exposed to information that reinforces their existing biases.
And then you have the 247 news cycle, which often focuses on conflict and scandal, further eroding public trust in institutions and leaders.
Exactly. And let's not forget about the economic anxieties that many people are feeling. Globalization, automation, and rising inequality have all contributed to a sense of unease and dissatisfaction.
So all of these factors combine to create a sense that the system is rigged against the average person, leading them to seek out alternatives, even if those alternatives are untested or lack concrete plans.
Precisely. It's a volatile political landscape. And it requires leaders who can connect with voters on an emotional level, offering a sense of hope and a vision for a better future.
And this is where Trudeau's warning about progressive messaging comes in, right? He's saying that they need to adapt their approach if they want to connect with these disillusioned voters.
Exactly. He argues that focusing on tangible issues, like the cost of living and economic growth, is crucial.
And avoiding the trap of framing everything through an ideological lens, that might alienate voters who are primarily concerned with their day-to-day lives.
Precisely. It's about finding common ground, emphasizing shared values, and offering practical solutions to the challenges people face.
Which is often easier said than done in our current political climate. But it's a challenge that progressives must overcome if they want to succeed in this new era of discontent.
Absolutely. Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to something Trudeau said that really struck me. He talked about getting into politics because he has kids, not in spite of them.
That's a powerful statement. It suggests a deep sense of purpose, a belief that public service is about building a better world for future generations.
It also highlights the personal sacrifices that come with leadership. The long hours, the constant scrutiny, the toll it takes on family life.
It's a reminder that behind the political personas are real people with families, hopes, and dreams.
And that the decisions they make have far-reaching consequences, not just for their own lives, but for the lives of millions.
So as Trudeau prepares to step down and spend more time with his family, what legacy do you think he leaves behind?
That's a question that will be debated for years to come. His supporters will point to his progressive policies, his commitment to diversity and inclusion, and his efforts to position Canada as a global leader on issues like climate change.
And his critics?
They'll likely focus on his perceived shortcomings, perhaps arguing that he was too focused on style over substance, or that he didn't do enough to address certain economic challenges.
It seems like a complex legacy, one that reflects both the triumphs and the limitations of a leader, navigating a turbulent political landscape.
But one thing is for certain. Trudeau's time in office has left an indelible mark on Canada, shaping the country's identity and its place in the world.
Okay, so we've covered Trudeau's legacy and his thoughts on global political trends. Is there anything else from this interview that you think is important for our listeners to understand?
Yeah, I think his comments about the importance of work-life balance really resonated with me. Even someone in his position, dealing with the pressures of leading a nation, still recognizes the need to step back and prioritize family.
That's a good point. It humanizes him a bit, doesn't it? It reminds us that even world leaders are just people with the same basic needs and desires as the rest of us.
Exactly. And it makes his decision to step down seem all the more understandable.
Right, like he's saying, I've given my all to this job, but now it's time to focus on other things that are important to me, like spending time with my family. And you know who can blame him for that?
Absolutely not. It's a sentiment I think a lot of people can relate to, regardless of their profession or position in life.
Well, I think you've really highlighted the complexities of Trudeau's time in office and the challenges he faced, particularly when it came to dealing with someone like Trump. It makes you wonder what it was like to be in his shoes, trying to balance domestic pressures with international relations, all while navigating this ever-shifting political landscape.
It couldn't have been easy. And what's fascinating to me is how he seems to have found a way to maintain a sense of humor and optimism throughout it all. Remember his playful response to Trump's annexation idea. It shows a certain resilience, a refusal to be rattled by even the most outlandish pronouncements.
Right. It's like he's saying, okay, you want to play that game? Fine, but I'm going to do it on my own terms.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
I think that's an important lesson for all of us, whether we're dealing with world leaders or just the everyday stresses of life. It's about finding that balance between taking things seriously and not letting them get you down.
I like that. So as we wrap up our deep dive into this interview with Justin Trudeau, what are some of the key takeaways you think our listeners should keep in mind?
Well, I think one of the most important things we've learned is that the relationship between the U.S. and Canada is complex and multifaceted. It's not always smooth sailing, and there are bound to be disagreements and challenges along the way.
But despite those challenges, the two countries remain deeply interconnected, both economically and culturally.
Absolutely. And it's in both of their best interests to find ways to cooperate and collaborate, even when they don't see eye to eye on everything.
I think Trudeau's insights on the global political climate are also incredibly relevant, especially his warning about the need for progressives to adapt their messaging if they want to connect with voters who are feeling disillusioned and disenchanted.
He's basically saying that if they don't find a way to address people's everyday concerns and offer tangible solutions, they risk losing ground to populist movements that are often better at exploiting those anxieties.
It's a powerful message and one that I think we all need to pay attention to, regardless of our political beliefs.
I agree, and I think it's something that Trudeau himself is still grappling with. As he prepares to leave office, he's clearly given this a lot of thought, and his insights are valuable, even if they don't offer easy answers.
So as we say goodbye to Justin Trudeau as Prime Minister, what do you think his legacy will be?
I think it's too early to say for sure. History will ultimately judge his time in office. But one thing is certain. He's been a transformative figure, both in Canada and on the world stage. He's challenged conventions, pushed boundaries, and sparked important conversations about everything from climate change to social justice to the future of democracy itself.
He's definitely made his mark. Well, folks, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the complexities of U.S.-Canada relations, delved into the global rise of anti-incumbent sentiment, and even gleaned some insights into the challenges of leadership in a polarized world.
And all of this from just one interview. It just goes to show that sometimes the most valuable information comes from unexpected sources.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, I have one final question for you. Did any of Trudeau's insights about political trends and progressive messaging resonate with you? What do you think the future holds for U.S.-Canada relations, especially now that Trudeau is stepping down?
That's a great question, and one that I don't think has an easy answer. I think it'll be fascinating to see how the dynamic between the two countries evolves in the coming years, especially with new leadership on both sides of the border. But one thing's for sure, the relationship between the U.S. and Canada will always be crucial, and one that deserves our attention and understanding.
Couldn't agree more. So thank you so much for sharing your insights with us today.
It's been my pleasure. Always enjoy these conversations.
And to our listeners out there, we hope you found this deep dive informative and thought-provoking. Remember, staying informed is a journey, not a destination. Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those conversations going. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
For another fascinating exploration of the ideas that shape our world.